Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I know at this time, as one of my esteemed colleagues did say, we're standing between people and some wine, some laughter and conversation.
You know?
So, Your Excellencies, business leaders, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is certainly an honor to be part of this panel today, where we will not only talk about the ABLC, but most importantly, some of the discussion will include the topics already framed by my colleague. You might or might not be aware, but the ABLC, being the Africa Business Leadership Coalition, was established in 2022, and this is almost a year of it having come into existence. The year has moved on speedily with a lot of successes. Allow me to share what the ABLC has been able to accomplish in a period of less than 12 months. We already have 58 companies that are members, and these are spread across the continent of Africa. These companies represent 1 million employees as well as $150 billion in revenue. This is just the beginning of what we believe as ABLC to be a long and a successful journey in giving Africa's private sector a much needed loud voice, as was said, loud and bold voice, if I draw from one of our esteemed politicians who spoke earlier this morning. The coalition's focus is to develop a new narrative for private sector climate action. And I mean, it's really around a narrative where Africans provide solutions to Africa whilst also mobilizing support from the international community. I do believe, as most of us who are members of ABLC, that companies from Africa are raising the bar for the rest of the world. But we all know that business cannot do this alone. We hear from business leaders who will share their own experiences that insufficient policy incentives certainly does inhibit sustainability progress. And of course, as such, more engagement is required between government and the private sector to engage on sustainability targets. And as such, more dialogue between the two primaries and partnerships is required. Ladies and gentlemen, as I sit before you, I can say the facts are clear. Today, we know Africa is an endowed as well as critical player in the climate transition of this world. Africa, as a key investment destination, is ready and willing to accept capital. We, as Africa, are ripe for further innovation that we have seen across many other sectors, which include telecoms and banking. And our belief is that climate change will be no different. As companies, we are ready to work with governments in Africa in shaping policies that we believe will support the exponential growth of climate solutions. So today, my esteemed colleagues will, amongst other topics, touch on the ABLC climate commitments. We will also hear from the high-level climate champion special advisor on how the African private sector can play a pivotal role in driving systematic climate action in the continent. With those introductory remarks, allow me to once again introduce esteemed members of our panel. To my right is Mr. Martin Oching, the CEO of Sasini PLC, who's a member of ABLC Kenya, as well as board chair of the Kenya Local Network. To his right, Mr. Daniel Saki, the regional executive for Anglophone West Africa, EcoBank. To his right, Mr. Ayman Ismail, chairman and CEO of DMG, and also part of the steering committee of the ABLC. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, no panel would ever be complete without a rose. Allow me to introduce Ms. Bukhulu Kenewendo, Special Advisor to the United Nations High-Level Climate Champions. I thank you all for taking the time to join us today. So Bukhulu, let's start with you. 2 weeks ago, in what is a very groundbreaking event, heads of state met at the Africa Climate Summit in Kenya, which was also at one of the BLC events. You did share that the private sector from Africa is uniquely positioned to drive innovative solutions for climate change. Can you just share a few of your thoughts on what the Africa Climate Summit has achieved, especially for the private sector, and what actionable takeaways from companies from the Nairobi Declaration and the private sector statement are.
Great, thank you so much. And I prefer to be a lily. So after this, buy me one. Thank you. It was actually a really good first inaugural summit, the Africa Climate Action Summit. And we've seen a really good positive narrative coming out of the climate summit in the leadership that the continent can give and provide in climate action. And this really mirrors the narrative that ABLC put forward last year at COP27. And one of the main things that I see as an outcome here is a recognition of the private sector's role in mobilizing finance and in delivering and implementing climate action in the continent. Now, this is very important because in the continent, total debt is public debt is well over $1.3 trillion, and our needs are well over $1.3 trillion, and per annum is about 200 billion or so. And if you have over 67 African countries that are already struggling with their fiscal space, and yet need all of this money to deal with adaptation and resilience, it's clear that that money should be mobilized from the private sector. And so there has been that clear call of how the private sector could engage in mobilizing capital. And one of those is the need for recapitalization of some of the MDB funds, and a call for MDBs, both international and African, to originate and distribute and work on credit enhancement tools that will allow for the private sector to actually want to participate in financing infrastructure, but also adaptation and resilience projects in the continent. But over and above that, it's also about who gets to implement the projects. And so we've seen a bit of space being created even within the nationally determined contributions that allows for the private sector to actually play an active role. And lastly, it's also in a very clear call to action of how do our businesses, both in manufacturing and services, actually lead the call for within this green development agenda and a climate positive growth that the presidents were positioning during this Climate Action Summit.
Thank you very much, Bukhulu, for that very comprehensive and, I must say, very insightful response. I think this is the perfect time to segue to you, Daniel. I know now I'm working out of script, but certainly since we're talking numbers, big numbers at that, maybe you can speak a little bit more around how the financing gap actually serves as a constraint to growth as well as limits Africa's potential. But importantly, you can talk to how financial institutions within the continent, despite all of this, continue to find solutions and push forward despite these constraints. And I think this type of topic, feeds into, I think, discussions that were held earlier today, as well as elsewhere in the world, where we talk about the cost of capital that Africa has to bear in relation to the rest of the world, and how that finds itself in impacting negatively or positively some of the funding that we require as part of this transition.
Thank you very much, and thank you. Glad to be here. And just following up on the first speaker's point, the financing gap is real. In several publications, it's put up around 250 to 300 billion per annum that is needed by Africa to really be able to implement its NDCs. And looking at data from about 51 out of the 53 African countries that were surveyed, where public information was available, the actual investment in that space was around 20 billion. And you don't need any further data to tell you that the gap is real. And just following up on your second question so that I can pick it first, the fact that if you have a huge gap and then the current order also makes capital very expensive for Africa, will that order change? No. Against the background that several African countries have gone or opted for structural adjustment programs to deal with frailties, vulnerabilities in their program post-COVID, post-Russia, Ukraine, and post probably a bit of mismanagement internally. The reality is that financing cost is not going to come down today or in the shortest possible time. So how does Africa resolve this problem of the gap that exists and also the cost of capital, even from currently available sources? That is where the private sector comes in. That is where institutions like EcoBank come in. Working together with governments, working together with other financial institutions, we have a unique opportunity to deal with this challenge. And we consider it not just as a challenge, but it also presents a unique opportunity for us to see what we can do in that space. Specifically, collaborating with government. Earlier discussions have talked about government setting the agenda in terms of incentives, in terms of trying to capacitate companies and then businesses operating in that sector. Africa then has a bigger challenge because unlike the developed countries that are now today dealing with having to deconstruct infrastructure, Africa actually has an opportunity to leapfrog by building structures from the ground because there is nothing. If you use the unique example of mobile money, how it has scaled financial inclusion across the African continent, then similarly we believe that there is an opportunity today for African countries and also for financial institutions to play a huge role in catapulting this change that is needed. So yes, there is a gap. Yes, finance is not there. However, existing institutions that have the capacity to work with government, and also government itself recognizing that there's an opportunity to partner with private sector, can accelerate this goal. Specifically, climate-related financing we've not been able to create bankable sort of projects that can be funded very easily. So private sector needs to work with companies in that sector to see how quickly we can bring projects to a stage where they can be banked. Institutions like Afrexim, the World Bank, the IFC, and others would actually only come in when the project is in a state where it can be funded or where it can be supported. And that is where we then play a role. Working with the IFC, for example, we've been able to do a 250 million euro structure in Senegal, looking at the first cement production factory, because Africa needs infrastructure. The panel that ended earlier on talked about cement production in Nigeria and the role it can play, even in changing the road infrastructure network. So we've done something like that with the IFC that looks at being able to utilize local resources to produce cement with the lowest carbon footprint in Africa today. And it's feasible because collaborating with about 4 or 5 financial institutions who can pool resources together, work with IFC, and then bring this to the table. Similarly, we've worked with the GCF to put a $30 million facility to sort of accelerate solar adoption by smallholder businesses. We've done a similar thing with the AFDB for women-led businesses that will typically target around 40, 50,000 SMEs that are led by women. And it's also to accelerate the adoption of solar and other clean energy initiatives. These are just a few of the examples how the private sector, working with government and other stakeholders, can quickly bridge the gap. And as I said, not just start from a very small base, but also leapfrog what should be done, because there is nothing in several of the areas where we are working with. And we can leverage on digital, using the mobile money as an example, to grow very quickly.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel, especially for sharing what the banks are doing or financial institutions and how they are contributing to Africa's green transition journey. A lot of what was discussed today also turns on the private sector as well as the public sector engaging. I think talks of collaboration, partnerships, discussions are high-level themes. So to you, Martin and Ayman, can you just share as players within the private sector as to how you believe the public and private sectors must cooperate to achieve this sustainable development? And importantly, what you believe should be the role that government actually plays in accelerating and ensuring a far more enabling policy environment that will unblock some of the things that we believe prevent us from reaching some of the climate change or climate action that we want to pursue. Thank you.
And I think you've answered the question in a way. I mean, if you think about it, let's be honest, government is slow. And so you started by saying, how can we collaborate? What do we do to talk to each other, to work together? I think we need to stop talking. I think we've talked enough. We are going to COP28, which means what, 28 years? What have we done? What do we have to show for it? And we really need to sit back and think about taking action and doing stuff that now then pulls everybody else with us. So I'll give you an example from Kenya. The government is very focused on putting in policies, especially climate action policies, to help organizations then start to invest in that area. But the private businesses are not waiting for that because it will take long. There are multi-stakeholders that you need to talk to. And for us, in terms of the ability to impact that particular topic positively, we can start now. So I'll give you a very quick example with Sasini, for example. Last year when we were at Sharm el-Sheikh, this group made a commitment on climate action. That was in December, I think it was. We went back and within 3 months commissioned a 1.5 megawatt solar power generation station that we launched in May this year. Out of that commitment, 600 million later. And what that does, it replaces 30% of our consumption from the national grid at a third of the cost. So it costs us 25 cents per kilowatt hour to run our factories. We are a major agricultural business in East Africa involved in tea, coffee, avocado, and macadamia, growing, processing, marketing, and exporting. And so we run these 24-hour factories to do that processing. The solar generation is 8 cents per kilowatt hour. So it makes sense, even from a profit perspective, to do this so that you can generate more money to then put into more of these initiatives that we are doing. And so if you ask me where that collaboration needs to go, I think government needs to continue driving the policy platform because we do need that to be effective, but the private sector needs to start doing. And if you're sitting in that sector, and these guys will tell you now, all of them have things that we can put on the table that we've done in the last 1 year or 2 years or so that are impactful towards some of these SDGs. And I think we must continue doing that.
Thank you, Martin. Ayman?
Yeah, I can't agree more with Martin, and I'd like to take another angle, given that we're talking here about the ABLC. I think, you know, in real life, we have today a platform that's actually pretty unique. Because I think as much as we talk about the government and want the government to move and to make action, we all know the realities that the government has to deal with. Like, I think one of the great professors in Columbia University yesterday was explaining the balance that the government needs to do between, you know, the energy transition to the energy justice to the energy security now after what's happening out in Ukraine. So they have a lot to deal with. On the other hand, I think private sector is fragmented. We are not one entity. We're not one big body that can actually move the needle. And that's why I'm very, very, enthusiastic about the ABLC, because I think all of a sudden, today we started with 50 companies. I think we're targeting to get to 100 companies. And we're also trying to get diversity of the type of companies that we have in the ABLC. And that actually gives a very, very unique platform for us to operate from. Because at the end of the day, you know, there's nobody better than us leading the policy write-up. I think the government needs to come and be a part of what we're trying to do. But then when you have a coalition that actually work across the whole Africa, and I think it's actually very smart to make it an Africa coalition rather than a Middle East, because that's basically where we can make the biggest difference in Africa. This is where, you know, the resources are in Africa, right? The biggest needs are in Africa. The young population are in Africa. I think, all the studies right now shows that 60% of the young population will be in Africa, not in China, not anywhere else. So I think I'm very, very enthusiastic about, the ABLC, and I think we should be taking the lead and put some specific action. I agree with Martin, and make sure that we hold ourselves against those actions and make them happen.
Thank you, Ayman. And as members of the ABLC, what do you see as probably the most critical actions that you believe the coalition must collectively take to build the Africa that we want future generations to inherit?
Sharing the impact. So we started with 15, I think, and in a year we've grown to almost 60 companies. And what it is strong leaders who believe in the commitment to the SDGs, and especially and very specifically to the climate topic. And so if you see Martin doing something else with his organization that inspires you to do the same with the organization, that creates momentum. And that's what we want to do. So in my view, if you ask me, I think this group of companies that have come together with the strong leaders and some of the best organizations in the continent are showcasing by doing and not talking and convincing others that, come on, join us so that we can keep pushing together. So I think that impact is what we want to create. And in fact, we are talking about growing the base to 100 companies, maybe even more. And the reason for that is then we want scale. Because once you do it, I mean, Sasini, yes, it's the biggest agricultural business in East Africa, but it can only do so much. So if another one comes on, another one comes on, and before you know, the whole continent is 30% on renewable sources of energy. So that's a good thing. And I think that's where we can be influential.
Yeah, I agree, and I add to that that basically one of the things that we need to do right now is to focus, because there's so many things going on, right? And I think that's what we had the discussion yesterday during the ABLC meeting, that we want to focus on what would be the top 3 issues facing Africa that actually relevant for across all those companies. And I agree with Martin that I think diversifying the type of companies that we have in the ABLC is important. I think entrepreneurs being part of the ABLC, those startups, this is the future. And these people think differently, and many of those companies are more tuned to the world that we're going into than actually some of the larger companies. So that mix would be very good. The other area that I when I was working in Procter & Gamble that I think worked very well for a large company like Procter & Gamble is a program that we called simply Search and Reapply. So if we have one market in the world or one company in Africa doing something well, how can we take that and turn it into another company that's actually similar to that company, but in a different part of Africa? And by doing that, all of a sudden, the multiplier effect that you would get out of that will actually speed matter in a way that nobody else can do.
Thank you. And finally, Bugolo, with the African Union recently being accorded the status of permanent membership of the G20, which is an exceptional recognition of Africa, its efforts on the global stage. In what areas do you believe the private sector can build on this positive momentum and particularly push for accelerated change, especially ahead of COP28?
Right. The ABLC statement last year was a game changer, quite groundbreaking for private sector in EMD markets to show leadership in what's possible in our common future to 1.5 degree. And I think that it certainly should be used, and the progress since then should be used as an advocacy tool within the B20 alongside the AU membership, and really push for more action and more investments to go into Africa in adaptation and resilience, way beyond just the mitigation space, because there's high demand in health, there's high demand in education and clean cooking and others, where there's a need for financing. But I think beyond just the AU being a member of the G20, the way I see, and we discussed the ABLC last year, is you position ambition from the continent, and you use that ambition and action from that ambition to change the perception of investment in the continent. And this is something that we need. We have heard GFANZ and others announce that they have large assets under management and that they are going to be investing them for the transition. And yet, there were no commitments of that investment going to EMDE markets. And there's something we've challenged them, and they keep saying, in part, not just GFANZ, that there's such high risk of investment in the continent. They are uncertain about the stability of the economy, of the economies in the continent. And yet members of the ABLC represent some of the largest businesses in the continent, and they have been able to have groundbreaking investments in 1 year. That in itself the ambition, the action, the implementables should be able to change the perception of investment and to raise ambition of global entities that are looking at how they actually intersect with the continent and EMDE markets.
Thank you, Bukhulu.
Well
Ladies
done,
and
well done.
So, ladies and gentlemen, you heard it first at Gabi on day one. Ambition, Africa, rising. It's all about Africans doing it for themselves, African solutions, and alongside it, as we know, is the good work that is actually being done by the Africa Business Leadership Coalition. I wish to thank my esteemed colleagues who have taken time to join us today, to you who has been a wonderful audience, and at this point we say, Salani Gashi.